The Iranian parliament has voted to close the strategically vital Strait of Hormuz.
If Iran actually carry out what they've threatened to do, would be 3 times the size of the shocks we've seen in the past.
It would be, I think, a massive escalation that would merit a response, not just by us, but from others.
The ongoing conflict between Israel and Iran could plunge the entire global economy into recession.
Hey guys, welcome to Cashcraft Finance. So it's official, things are going from bad to worse. For the first time ever in history, Iran is reportedly moving to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which, if successful, has the potential to completely destroy the global economy. Like, without exaggeration, this 2-mile shipping route is the lifeline from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. 20 million barrels of oil pass through here daily. And if it's shut down even just temporarily, the fallout would be absolutely disastrous. This is why we have to talk about exactly what just happened. Why the Strait of Hormuz is suddenly becoming a worldwide issue, how the United States suddenly got involved, and then how this is likely to affect you very soon. Because unlike my previous videos, where I just recommend dollar cost averaging into a broad index fund, regardless of what happens, you deserve to know with facts what's actually going on, and why this is so quickly becoming such a big deal. Although before we start, as usual, if you appreciate the unbiased breaking news videos like this, just the important information to bring you up to speed, it would mean the world to me if you hit the like button or subscribe. If you haven't done that already, it's like more than that later, or so in terms of what's going on, all of this comes down to one singular point: Strait of Hormuz. For those unaware, this is a narrow stretch of water that separates the Persian Gulf from the rest of the world. And in terms of its importance, 1, it's surrounded by major oil-producing countries, who make up half of the world's supply. 2, geographically, it is the only passage from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. And 3, Iran has significant influence to make it nearly impossible for anybody to enter or exit, making this really the perfect storm. See, 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply and 1/3 of the world's entire natural gas that passes through this small waterway on a daily basis. And unfortunately, there are very few, if any, alternatives if something or someone were to block ships from passing through. Meaning this one little area basically controls the entire world. Now, in terms of who benefits the most from this strait being opened, the honest answer is everybody. Like, sure, even though it's true that 84% of the oil and gas exports that pass through there go to Asian markets like China, by keeping the oil flowing, it frees up supply from other energy producers, which allows the United States market to operate more efficiently. It helps keep prices stable and reduces the impact of supply shocks. All of this is thanks to what's called a transit passage. This is a legal framework under the United Nations Law of Sea, which allows commercial ships to pass through areas like the Strait of Hormuz. But there's a bit of a catch. Within the 2-mile-wide transit lane, parts fall within Iran's territorial waters, and even though so far they've complied with the United Nations, they've never ratified the agreement to allow for open transit, meaning they could turn their backs to try to prevent ships from passing through their territory, which is what's beginning to happen. After the United States attacked Iran's strategic facilities over the weekend, Iran threatened to close the strait entirely, which would disrupt the flow of oil and basically shut down the entire world. So what would happen if this were to actually go through? Well, to talk about that, you first have to understand oil prices on the most basic level. The United States uses about 20 million barrels of oil every single day, which makes us the #1 consumer of oil in the world by far. But there's a bit of a catch. Since we only produce 18.6 million barrels of oil a day, we've become reliant on other countries to help fill that deficit. And this is where things get interesting. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed off, even just temporarily, all of a sudden oil prices would rise. Shipping costs would increase, production of raw materials goes up in price, and transportation would become that much more expensive. Like, the Federal Reserve estimates that every $10 a barrel jump in crude oil prices could result in 0.2% more inflation. On top of that, the United States personally receives about 7% of its entire oil supply directly from the Strait of Hormuz, leaving us with no other option other than to pay higher prices to other exporting nations that are closer to us, like Mexico and Canada. Look, to give you an idea just how sensitive oil prices have recently become, even the risk of a potential shutdown caused oil to spike 10% pretty much overnight. And in terms of how high it could go, JP Morgan believes that we could see oil rise as high as $130 a barrel in the event it's closed for a sustained period. This would likely lead to what's called cost push inflation, which occurs when energy prices are on the rise, and because manufacturing costs increase, that eventually gets passed on to use the consumer, in the form of higher prices. That in turn is likely to lead to higher inflation numbers, which would result in the Fed keeping higher interest rates for longer, which increases the cost of borrowing. It's also reasonable to expect that, as higher energy costs take up a larger percentage of disposable income, people's spending would scale back, which is negative for stocks. But this is really only the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the world, including China, Japan, India, and South Korea, they are directly reliant on the oil imported through this narrow passageway. So if this shuts down, they would feel the most immediate and most intense effects, effectively just destroying the global economy. But again, all of this is just barely scratching the surface. If the strait were closed, it could very quickly and easily turn into a global catastrophe of military escalation, as practically every country does whatever they can to get the strait back open, by whatever means necessary. In fact, it's just reported that there are close to 50 large oil tankers scrambling to leave the Strait of Hormuz right now, with the expectation that the strait could be blockaded. In the coming days, even President Trump said that any retaliation by Iran against the United States of America will be met with force far greater than what was witnessed tonight, which refers to the recent operations to disable any of Iran's potential experiment. I'm being very gentle with my words here, if you couldn't tell, just so the video doesn't get restricted in any means. So bear with me on some of this anyway, in terms of whether or not the Strait of Hormuz could actually be shut down, and the realistic impacts this would have on the global economy. Here's what you came for, because believe it or not, this is not the first time that we've gotten close to a shutdown. Alright, so in terms of what could happen next, let's talk about the biggest topic on everybody's mind, and that would be closing the Strait of Hormuz. Up until this point, thankfully, there has not been an actual closure, because the impact would be pretty far-reaching, and Iran would pretty much isolate themselves from the rest of the world by cutting off their access to natural resources. But that doesn't mean there haven't been some very close calls in the past, like the tanker battle of the 1980s. During a territorial dispute between Iran and Iraq, both sides attacked commercial tankers in the Gulf, with the expectation of cutting off the other's oil supply. But even though there was an ongoing battle and some trade was temporarily disrupted, the strait was never closed, because doing so would do more damage than necessary and hurt both sides equally. So the markets eventually just recovered. After that, though, the 2012 sanctions threat. This escalated when the United States blamed Iran for a series of tanker attacks in the Gulf, which were carrying petroleum products from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, as you would assume. Iran once again threatened to close off the strait as a punishment for disrupting their economy, which resulted in the price of oil increasing 4%. Due to heightened uncertainty, wouldn't you know it, the strait was never actually closed. Essentially, the chance of Iran closing the strait has such high consequences that if they did, they would face almost immediate backlash, especially since China is one of the top recipients of all the oil coming out of the region, and since Iran and China are on good terms, having worked together for the last few decades, it's unlikely that Iran would do anything to jeopardize their largest alliance. But that also does not mean that markets will not react very negatively until it's eventually resolved. And this is what we are currently seeing over. No surprise, we are seeing higher oil prices almost immediately, purely because oil flow could be disrupted. And insurance prices on oil ships have increased 60% in just the last few weeks. All of this is likely to result in higher inflation, and it might continue for quite some time. For example, the former energy advisor just said that shipping could be interrupted for weeks or months, rather than the oil market's view that the US Navy would resolve the situation in hours or days. On top of that, we're also seeing a bit of a sell in the stock markets because higher prices threaten to cause the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates higher for longer, not to mention if costs do increase. Consumer spending is expected to pull back by a lot, given that 57% of Americans are already living paycheck to paycheck. This sell-off is also evident throughout Bitcoin, which recently fell below $100,000 as investors grow weary of international conflict during a time. Let's be real, anything can happen. However, to help dampen some of these concerns, there is some good news. The United States has what's called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which was created in 1975 after the Saudi oil embargo caused oil prices to nearly quadruple within a single year. This reserve, which currently holds nearly 400 million barrels of oil, is meant to be used in such a way for the United States to maintain reasonable levels of oil within the country during times of need or in the event of an emergency. All of this suggests that if the strait were closed off, the United States would have enough oil to sustain itself until, hopefully, the strait is opened back up again. And even though certainly prices would go higher, it wouldn't be enough to cripple the US economy overnight, hopefully. That's why, in terms of what I think about this, is a random dude on YouTube making videos in a half-converted garage. One personally think that the chance of it actually shutting down is pretty much slim. to none, and any threats we see are probably baseless and not actually going to happen. Because let's be real, if they closed it down, it probably wouldn't be closed for long, because they would have the full force of the United States and the rest of the world to doing anything they can to get it back open again. Not to mention, based on the multiple past threats of a shutdown, that's never actually materialized. I have no doubt that this time is probably not going to be any different. But then again, anything can happen. And as much as I would love for this to be resolved as soon as possible, sometimes these events unfortunately are rather unpredictable. So let me know what you guys think down below in the comment section. I will do my best to read and reply to as many of you as I can. I hope this was helpful, and until next time.